Hello, everyone, and welcome to this next plenary session. We got the narrow topic of the day, just a little question of fixing capitalism. So I'm sure that we'll be able to fix that one just in the next couple of minutes alone. But seriously, we are in luck. Capitalism is the best self-correcting system that we know. At the same time, we also know that there are big structural problems, persistent problems in our society, and it's the responsibility of big economic actors to step in and see what they can do to address those issues. I'm talking persistent gender pay gap, persistent racial wealth gap. Why is it that with all the technology that we have, we see so little emissions reductions putting our planet in harm's way? And then the question becomes, whose job is it to fix it? Is it that the rules are broken? Is it the enforcement of the rules that are broken? Or is it the responsibility of private actors to step in? And in fact, we don't need big, heavy hand of government. Joining me to discuss all of those issues, we've got three fantastic corporate leaders: Jonas Prising, Chairman and CEO of Manpower Group; Amy Weaver, the President and CFO of Salesforce; and Manny Maceda, who's the Global CEO of Bain & Company. Welcome to each of you to this session.
Thank you, Ryan. Nice to be here.
Great to be here.
I might dive in with a question to you first, Jonas. We see the demands of workers just becoming more and more prominent in public debate now. Those demands have been at the forefront of debate in past eras. Sometimes that was around labor strikes. Sometimes there was violence involved. Often it was black and white positioning of worker versus employer. And it feels like this time round, there are some really legitimate needs, but that the kind of institutional framework is a little bit different. And I wanted you to give us a sense of what the Manpower data is saying. Why are so many workers saying enough is enough, either around their wages, where they work, or the conditions that they have when they work?
Well, thank you, Ryan. And what our data is telling us is that many workers have experienced the structural changes that have happened over many decades, and at least the last 12 to 11 years, very strongly in many labor markets in developed countries, on a fast forward track during the pandemic. So the differences that we knew existed and had started to act upon before the pandemic have really come to the full light of day. And that is something, of course, that workers are reacting towards, and they are expressing their desire to combine working life with their personal life to a much greater degree. And that manifests itself in a few ways that, I'm sure we all recognize. First of all, you can see that, the employer hiring desire coming out of the pandemic is extremely strong, very, very strong, with, a lot of employers globally wanting to find people with the right skills to come and join them. And at the same time, you're seeing that many workers are still on the sidelines. Here in the US and different parts of Europe, talent shortages are the common theme of this economic recovery everywhere. So it's not a country issue. It is a post-pandemic or a pandemic issue where people are choosing not to re-engage in the workforce because they have conflicting needs. They still have healthcare and childcare issues. They may want to change sectors because during the pandemic, many of the service jobs that millions and millions of people were engaged in were completely shut down. So they're now evolving and trying to think about what else could they do. And the desire for more flexibility. And that's what we hear the clearest from workers. This is a request that has been existing for many, many years. And now during the pandemic, for those that are able to access technology and use that technology, we can see that it is actually possible to run a company remotely to some degree, for some of the time at least. And that is now really something that workers are very interested in having as they move forward.
If I could turn to you next, Amy, I'm wondering, I look at, data such as Edelman's Trust Barometer, and it's been consistently showing for a few years now that when people, they say my employer is the most trusted person in their world, or the most trusted figurehead or institution in their orbit. And I'm wondering how COVID has amplified or changed that sense for you, and what does it mean for Salesforce's approach to stakeholder capitalism, both with your workers and with the wider communities that you're serving?
Great. Thanks, Ryan. And apologies, I think I showed up a few minutes into this. I never thought Wi-Fi connectedness would have such a dominant role in my life, but once again, it gave out at just the wrong moment today. But really thrilled to be here. I also have to thank Jonas and call out that I spent many summers as a manpower temp. So I am very fond of the company, and I know the power it has to change people's lives. So really delighted to make that connection. In terms of stakeholder capitalism, Salesforce was born in the mindset that business could be a platform for change. And in fact, when the company was first created back in 1999, Mark and Parker and the two other founders made a commitment at that point that 1% of the equity, 1% of employee time, and 1% of our product would always go to good causes. And in 1999, with 4 people, that didn't mean a lot. Over time, that has led to an incredible commitment to hundreds of millions of dollars of donations, millions of hours of employee time, and 50,000 nonprofits running on our product. But what it has done more than that is it's really become kind of the heart and soul of the company. And we know that people come to Salesforce and that they stay at Salesforce because of that commitment. I don't think that there's any question that employees want to be at a company that they believe reflects their values. And especially as we look at the past 18 months, we look at how there's really no line between a company and the community you're in. I think for a long time it was, companies were viewed as islands. You had your corporation and then you had the community you were embedded with. I think we can see very clearly now that a hospital's capacity, a public school being open, small businesses surrounding our offices, all of this is part of what makes Salesforce vibrant. And it just renews our commitment to stakeholder capitalism and looking after all of these different groups.
That's great. Manny, when I think about Bain, I think about you finding ways to help your clients serve their customers better. And obviously, companies have to respond to their customers. Otherwise, they're going to go out of business fairly quickly. But the demands of those customers, the needs of customers are getting more nuanced and more numerous as the world gets more complex. So I was wondering if you could tell us what other sorts of coalitions and partnerships that you think need to drive the sort of cross-industry, cross-border collaborations that are going to actually allow us to have sustainable societies going forward, and what's the sort of advice you give clients when they come to you with that sort of problem?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan, and I'm excited to be here with Jonas and Amy, both great firms. I'll broaden the question a little bit around stakeholder capitalism. You said, let's take a customer and the client angle. We call our customers clients, but there's a direct linkage to especially for service businesses that we're all in, between client loyalty, client demands, and talent. And so for all of us who have, and I echo Jonas's comments, we're in a post-pandemic war for talent phase for many industries, where people are voting with their feet which companies they want to work for. Having purpose in a corporation matters. And things like Salesforce has done around the 1+1. We've done our equivalent of that. 2% of our capacity goes to nonprofits. But what I am seeing is that in this world of stakeholder capitalism, the 98%, the core of what we do, has to take this on because of your question, that customers are expecting, demanding. All of us are actually B2B customers of each other, partners of each other. That the role of the corporation to actually make change happen. The statement that the Business Roundtable here in the US that we're members of changed what the definition of a corporation was. And the term stakeholder itself means we have to take the needs of all of our different stakeholders, not just investors. And I'd argue for most corporations, besides your employees, the core of your stakeholders are your customers. And so what is happening, Ryan, I think, is that if you're a B2C company, the data varies, but something in the range of 75% of customers are saying they are willing to change their buying behavior based on the practices of the companies they buy for, on climate, on social issues, on ESG issues. For B2B companies, we all see that. We are now, when we do business with each other, we expect our partners, our suppliers, to be having appropriate climate strategies. We have to report. Are you going for net zero carbon by certain years? If you join the Business Roundtable today, the preeminent US large company organization, you are required to report your diversity statistics. And so if I see this trend, it's not a fad, it's not a trend. I think corporations are taking this very real, that for us to really make a difference in all the challenges of our world, we have to take this on as a core agenda. And maybe the last comment in your question is, we can't do that alone. Governments have a role. Horizontal organizations like this group, like the World Economic Forum, like the Business Roundtable, like sometimes unnatural alliances where competitors are banding together, but with a common goal of reducing plastics waste or hitting net zero carbon targets, are a way all of us are getting used to working as companies. And it's actually, I think, quite meaningfully different from, say, a decade ago.
Now, I have a question about the changing role of the chief financial officer in a company in addressing these questions of how to do more stakeholder capitalism. So it's a question for all of you, but maybe I'll start with you, Amy, as an actual CFO in the process, so you can be our expert commentator. And I guess the question is around, it costs money to invest in your community and to invest in stakeholders. And so I'd love to know, do you see your role as the person who develops the strategy around stakeholder capitalism commitments in the company, or since Salesforce originated with that commitment, is it more operational for you? And is the CFO the person who says no, who's always saying, putting the brakes on, or do you have to shift gears now and be the advocate for this sort of investment across the company?
Well, back in February, which is when I took on the role of CFO, I held a town hall. And the first thing I did was invite the head of sustainability, Patrick Flynn, to come join me and give a presentation. He started his presentation with the statement, "Accountants will save the world." Now, Patrick may have known his audience who loved the statement, but it was a very, very important moment for me, because he really captured what it means to make real change, and you have to be able to measure it. Manny said, as he said, his clients are demanding to know, what the standards are that Bain has. The SEC is needing this. This became so important in my mind that I actually wound up creating a role on my leadership team that our current CAO is going to take, which is going to be focused purely on finance and ESG. And this is going to be on how we spend the money, how we dedicate resources, and most of all, how we come up with the metrics so we can actually measure what we're doing. I think as soon as we can get to those metrics and the world can kind of align around one set, the more powerful that's going to be. So I don't view this as an area of saying no. I don't view this as an area of putting the brakes on. It's really an area of figuring out, how do we do this in a way that is going to make sense, that's clear, that's transparent, and that's going to scale over time. I think there's an incredible role for finance professionals to play, and I'm really excited about where we're going.
Great. Jonas,
maybe
do you have anything
could
to
jump
build
in
on that? Oh, sorry, Manny, you dive in.
Okay, maybe I'll be quick. That the role of CFO is so multifaceted, and I see Amy's president, CFO for companies. You play the role in internal resource allocation, and ESG matters. Metrics matter. The standardization of ESG metrics globally, something that many horizontal organizations are working on, I personally believe we're going to be in a world not that far from now where we're all doing cost accounting, financial accounting, and carbon accounting in a standardized way. And obviously, the other role of the CFO is as a vehicle to the investors of a company. And whether you are a public investor or a private investor, and we do a lot of work with private capital, the importance and prioritization that all investors are making on how good is a company achieving my goals. Very specific investment pools that only want to invest in companies that are sustainable and companies that are doing the right thing socially. I think the role of the CFO is critical. And Jonas, over to you.
And I would fully concur, Manny, as well as with you, Amy, because I think the outstanding issue remains standardized metrics that are needing to be agreed upon by all of these organizations that look at them, because that's when you actually have verifiable and comparable results and metrics that you can compare across industry sectors, that you can report to your shareholders and your stakeholders in a consistent way. So the role of the CFO not only is around the resource allocation towards those, because ultimately for this to be sustainable, it also has to make sense for the business. And I think that is the big shift that happened during the pandemic, that just as Amy said, the importance of values and mission and purpose is a way for the business to ensure that you attract and retain the talent that you need to have in the business to execute on your business strategies. Your adherence to climate regulation and be seen as a contributor to a solution as opposed to not is a clear way not only of attracting clients, but also talent into the business and gain more investor approvals and appreciation. So all of this ties back to what makes sense for the business and the broader stakeholder view. And in that, the CFO has a tremendously important role. Just as Manny said, there are still some ways to go on the metrics and the standards, because I think we're converging, but especially on the S, the environment, I think we're closer, but on the S, there is still a wide disparity of measures and metrics. But it's only a question of time before that gets narrowed down as well, I think, so that we can have the measurable impacts quantified also there.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point, actually, on the S of ESG, where I feel like that's probably the letter that has been least invested in, let's say, or maybe where the scale of the problems to be addressed are biggest. And then that gets at the heart of the tension of whose job it is to fix it. And you see some political parties, and I don't just speak of the US, I try and take a global view in the reporting that I do at Politico. Some people gravitate towards a tax and spend approach, or they automatically see government as a solution. Others are just afraid of unleashing the sort of things that we've seen over the past 18 months, the huge stimulus plans and the huge government intervention. So they're always trying to put on the brakes. And you guys don't know this, but before I started working for Politico, I worked for the EU for 7 years. And so my takeaway from that process was that there is real power in addressing very obvious market failures, but a lot of the time, actually, a lot of the laws were decent on the books and they're just not enforced properly. And I worked in the competition and antitrust field for a while, and there was real power in just using the laws that were there. We didn't need to reinvent the wheel all of the time. And I do all of that preamble to ask you where you see that boundary between private action and government intervention. We've seen with the pandemic, sometimes there are things only government can take charge of because they're so big, or there are so many actors that need to be convened. And then there are other times where it feels like people are just trying to expand their own power base, and maybe they aren't the best people to solve the problem at hand. So maybe I will, this time we'll go Amy, Jonas, Manny.
So, Ryan, I think a lot of this comes down to who has the information as well as who has the ability to act. And taking it to kind of a very, kind of a smaller scope of an issue. But one of the issues I have been really fascinated by and have a personal interest in is gender pay, which obviously touches ESG as well. And I think you'll all recall when this first started coming up as an issue, maybe 10, 15 years ago, what people would say is it was really up to the woman who felt that she might be underpaid to go in, pound the table, and demand more money. Now, a lot of problems with this. First, who wants an employee who is doing that? This is not necessarily what you want to encourage, but also you're asking the person who has the most to gain, but the least amount of information. If you're an employee, you usually don't know what anyone else is paid. You don't know the relative practices. What it has taken to make a difference in this area is doing what Salesforce did, which is the company said it's our responsibility. We have the data. We're going to do a survey and look and see where this comes out, and then we will make the adjustments. And I think whether we're talking about the environment, whether we're talking about racial issues, we have to look first at who has the information to make an accurate decision, and then who's got the power and the speed. And sometimes that's going to be the government, sometimes it's going to be private actions, but it's got to start with who has the data and the information.
Very wise advice. Jonas.
The lack of attention to the S in this, I think, is notable. And actually, if you want to look at, a clear example is the conference that we're in, which is a great conference over 5 days. And I believe this is the only workforce talent segment over these 5 days. And most of the other topics are either on business, but very heavily on climate. So on climate, the tipping point has happened. The data is there. Companies realize they have to be part of it. On the S side, in terms of the social aspects on people and prosperity, we're still a long ways from there. And I think Amy gave a great example on gender parity, but we know that diversity and inclusion, has a tremendous road to go. The main issue I believe that we'll be faced with going forward is the disparity between the haves and the have-nots in terms of skills. And we talk a lot about things like hybrid work, forgetting sometimes that mostly this is knowledge workers accessing, remote workplaces and practices. But about 60% of the workforce can't get access to it because they have customer-facing jobs that aren't able to be done remotely. And we believe that what we're seeing is companies are already taking responsibilities for their employees, and that's getting accelerated during the pandemic. And in the post-pandemic phase now, we see more and more companies committing to reskilling and upskilling their workforce, providing flexibility to their workforce, and doing all of the things that they can do to attract and retain and reskill and upskill their workforce. But the part that we're not addressing are those that feel marginalized in all of this evolution. And that's, of course, where government needs to come in just as forcefully as we have seen them do during this pandemic. All of the stimulus programs in all of the developed countries have massive amounts of resources allocated to creating green jobs, allocated to creating a greener economy. But there is no similar approach as it relates to addressing the gap of skills that many, many millions of workers will have as the structural changes keep on driving through the labor markets and causing these disparities. And those disparities ultimately lead to people not believing in the future for themselves, for their children, and for their families. And that then leads to the rise of populism and a desire to align yourself with thoughts that may not be supported by science or data and may actually be counterproductive to your own self-interest, but they are a way of protesting the evolution. And that's where I think government needs to take a much more strategic and forceful approach, just as they have done now on climate, so that we can address these growing disparities, because we're worried that disparities will continue to increase post-pandemic as opposed to stabilize and convert.
That's a point very well taken. Manny, over to you.
Thanks. I'll probably take this, I'll try to be complimentary and not repetitive to Amy and Jonas. I will say, in the original premise of the question, if you look at the E part of ESG, that's become really a global issue. So it's global. It's global governments, United Nations. The metrics are probably simpler because there's real math behind it. The S part is a very national issue, and it's a regional issue. yes, there are macro trends globally around wealth inequality, but the vast array of social issues that would be classified under S are often country specific. Race in the United States is probably the number one topic on S in this country the last year. The female issue is global, and we all want to make progress, but race in other countries, if you're in Japan, that's not as much of an issue. So it's very much when you say government, it's national, it's local, it's state, it's city, that makes this a more complicated issue to solve. Now, the role of business versus government, I think what companies have been doing on the S part, the starting point is role modeling what we can do ourselves. Can we behave in the right way as a great place to work, to role model diversity, inclusion, gender parity for what we can control? And I would say that back to reporting, the fact that we're all committed to this, and I don't think it's lip service, it's real, is a starting point. Now, the broader issue, which I'll start heading to, I think where Jonas is heading, is the inequalities in the world post-pandemic are real. The impact on small and medium enterprises, the impact on workers who don't necessarily have the skills. And so the role that businesses play back collectively, often in service or in conjunction with the government, will matter. Organizations, we're one of about 40 companies that have sponsoring group called 110. I'll just make a very specific example in the United States, where there are about 7 million Black Americans without four-year college degree. Typically, how do you get them into great sustainable jobs and actually stay and develop? And so the investments companies need to make in skilling, reskilling, sourcing, training, retaining, and go broader. And then same thing for the investors, as I see investors try to look at how do you invest to support people of color communities, small, medium enterprises that are getting decimated in post-COVID. We will have to, I think, step up as a business community in conjunction with government. But you're right. This is, in some cases, this is still the government's role to put that safety net for a large group. And unfortunately, we're heading to an even more unequal world at the moment.
Yeah, but to bring it back to that skills point for a second that Jonas was making, I did a podcast series on that last year, and what came up consistently in talking to labor market experts, people in the training field, manpower itself, was that an individual worker feels overwhelmed often in trying to figure out what skills will be needed in 5 or 10 years' time. So you really do need a manpower or the government to help fill in that picture. But the government can't decide what training course an individual person should do. So you need flexibility and partnerships and not have a central government trying to dictate what each individual should do in the process. So it really shows the need for all the actors to be involved in just unpicking even an individual's challenge, let alone like a big structural replication of that challenge over millions of people in a society. I have a question now. I'm trying to think how to weave this in. I'm thinking about what the American experience of capitalism is in 2021, and wondering whether you see any differences between questions and debates around the safety net in America, the E, the S, or the G, whatever it might be, versus your other market. Because we know, for example, that America has a fairly low minimum wage compared to some other advanced economies. There's a huge debate around the nature of the healthcare system and how it's provided and who gets access to it and so on. Do you see global trends in these demands for more sustainable systems and companies, or do you find that it's different market by market? Maybe Jonas, we'll start with you this time.
Much like the issue around S, just as Manny pointed out, a lot of this is based on national culture and history. If you take an example that I'm sure many of participants in the conferences hopefully will resonate with them, is this discussion around apprenticeships and how a really good way of giving practical skills to a lot of people, young and old, is a comprehensive system of apprenticeship. And citing often the example of Germany and Austria and Switzerland as those countries that have been very successful. Conveniently or not, forgetting the fact that these are systems that have been in place for hundreds of years. And when parents to somebody that goes through an apprenticeship successfully completes a master's course, there will be ads in the papers, celebrating that achievement. And you can think about, what the status of an apprenticeship is, in Germany versus one in other countries like the UK or the US, and realize that it's not as easy to transport labor market practices between countries. However, clearly we have seen that the US has gone much further during this downturn than we've ever done before. The differences, of course, are very stark. In the US, in March and April, we lost 20 million jobs last year. We've made 16 of those, or 14 of those have been made up, and we are still 6 million short pre-pandemic, which is one of the reasons why you're seeing the talent shortage. In Europe, as opposed to the US, almost no jobs were lost because the furlough support mechanism was all to maintain the employment in the companies, thinking that theirs is going to give us the opportunity, or rather Europe, to quickly ramp back up again when the economy gets going. I would say what's interesting to me is, despite two very starkly different approaches to the same issue, the end outcome is roughly the same. There are talent shortages in Europe just as much as there are talent shortages in the US, despite two radically different approaches, but they were similar in nature. They were aimed at maintaining employment and or earnings capacity during a very sharp downturn. So as much as things are getting different, we did learn from the Great Recession, and we are now applying ideas that maintaining employability during a downturn is important because it enables the economy to bounce back faster, which is a really clear sign of what we saw during the Great Recession, how slow the recovery was. Despite the economy coming back strong, the labor markets came back much, much slower. So I still think it is much of a national decision on how to do this in terms of mitigating the impacts of some of these changes. But at the same time, you can see that governments are addressing this in similar ways, because we can now look across countries and realize many of these structural changes that are occurring are not national in nature. They are structural and global in nature. And as such, the solutions to them can be very similar also across very different labor markets in different parts of the world.
Yeah, I think from Kristalina Georgieva's opening fireside chat this morning, she had said that the IMF has actually helped 86 countries already in the pandemic. And that is, maybe it's not enough, maybe it wasn't quick enough, but, that is a lot more countries, a lot faster receiving support than any of those previous crises that they've been dealing with. Manny, over to you. Anything to build on that from Jonas?
Yeah, I think Jonas' comment, especially on the U.S. versus Europe, is spot on. And I'll sort of add a separate thought in that, entering the system, entering a downturn, nobody knew how short this downturn was going to be. Consensus view, maybe 6 months. Turned out in practice for many advanced economies to basically be a 1/4 downturn. And the fact that while the expectation on job security in Europe was not something traditionally in the U.S. model, as you said, the outcome has been the same. The other thing, though, that has really been very different country by country is how the pandemic itself was managed, the health issues. The vaccination issues, the masking issues, the border issues, and so while we can sit here saying North America, Europe, we've had a very rapid bounce back. The challenge on the third world has not been the same, and frankly, even advanced countries, whether you're Korea or Japan or Singapore or Australia, the direct correlation between countries' performance and how the pandemic has been managed is I don't know that any of us expected in projecting how the upturn would come and what would it look like. That it's health policies as much as macroeconomic policies that would drive a variation in success coming out. And we're not done yet, by the way.
And Amy, is it different for a digital company? You know, Manpower and Bain have to be, in a sense, more physically present than a company like Salesforce needs to be to serve a global customer base. Do you find a different experience to them, or is it the same sort of thing, regardless of the fact that you're a digital company?
Well, being a digital company obviously made certainly the beginning of the pandemic much easier for us. We were literally able to send people home, and they were, vast majority, over 99% of our employees were able to power up on their laptop the next day and get right back to work. But that doesn't mean that employees weren't really ravaged by the effects of the pandemic. And one thing that we saw, and we saw this globally, was an incredible impact on employee mental health. And I remember 3 months in, we did an employee survey, and more than 40% of our employees said that they were struggling with mental health issues due to the pandemic. And frankly, I think that was the 40% who were willing to admit it. I think everyone was struggling. And I think that was global. And while there were very different approaches by governments around the world, I feel that what we have learned going through the pandemic is actually more universal than country by country. I think we've learned that a pandemic is by definition spreading everywhere. It's not something that we can isolate. It's not something that just a small group of people are going to be impacted by. And I think a lot of this also comes back to what you said when you opened up your comments, Ryan, about the most recent Edelman study. People during this time want to have a place they can feel safe, and they want trust. And it comes back to wanting employers that they can trust. They want employers who they feel have their values, and they want employers who are going to be looking out for them during this pandemic and helping them either performing in their current jobs, or, as Jonas has pointed out, helping to find what that next step is going to be as they go forward.
Now, I left one of the bigger questions for the end, and it's more a reflection of the fact that I'm not an expert and I don't run a company. So certainly don't take it as an insult. But when I sort of, as a journalist, look at the big picture of, kind of endless announcements and growing attention at tackling ESG issues, it feels like we are literally mobilizing trillions of dollars of capital and investing millions of people hours in solving these problems and trying to do the right thing, even if there's sometimes slightly different definitions of what that is. And then I look at some of the sort of leading indicators of social outcomes, and it doesn't feel like we made a 20% dent in emissions, or we bumped up the pay of women 10 or 15%. It feels like we're not yet getting the full return on investment from all of these great things that we've been talking about for the last 40, 45 minutes. And I'm wondering, am I missing something there? Is it that some of these things are lagging indicators and we're going to get all of the good news in a couple of years' time? Or is it that sort of somehow we're kind of fooling ourselves a little bit about the impact that we're having collectively? Maybe I'll go to you first, Jonas.
I think it's a little bit of some of these things combined. I do think it's a lagging factor, but I think a big change has occurred, and that is that businesses realize that to be successful as a business, these are issues they need to tackle and execute against and make a difference. Our stakeholders will, and including our shareholders, will hold us as businesses accountable to making a difference and proving that we've made a difference. Just last week, we submitted our science-based targets, that are then validated by this organization. And that is against, those targets that we will report our progress towards net zero in terms of our climate commitments. So that's a shift in terms of, generally speaking, about the benefits and how interested we are in making sure that we are a green company, we contribute to the solution, and providing targets that are now measurable and for which we are held accountable, both in the broader sense, but also to the board. So it becomes ingrained in how we run the business. So I would say that businesses is very sincere, is clearly understanding that for the health and the prosperity of their business and their ability to attract talent, they need to make concrete steps forward and contribute to the solution. And as such, I believe that we will start to see some more aspects of this come through also in the data. Some of it you are seeing that wages are moving up. You are seeing commitments to pay more, of course, coming on the back of a market which is also very dynamic and is requesting that talent. But it's very clear that companies are training more employees. They're providing them more development paths. They're very keen on keeping their people. They're very sincere in how they engage with climate targets. So I think on the whole, you'll start to see this come through also in the data, because business understands that this is a commitment that we make and a promise we make to our stakeholders that we will be held accountable to. And that will happen when they see the results. And as such, I think you'll start to see some more accelerated progress in a number of these areas.
Maybe I'll swing it back to you, Amy, to mix up the order.
Sure. So, Ryan, I think that it has really varied by issue. You mentioned gender equality. I actually do think we are making progress on pay on that. At Salesforce back in 2015, we announced we were going to do a study and we were going to announce the results publicly. This was before we knew how it was going to come out, and we were going to make a difference. Now, I'll tell you, at that point, I was general counsel. And I remember thinking, as a woman, this is fantastic. And as general counsel, I'm not sure this is a great idea. Because we didn't know what the study was going to show. Did the study, sure enough, it showed that we had some issues. We put money towards fixing that. We also realized we had to do it every single year. We've now done that study 6 years in a row. We've expanded it to cover race where those numbers are available. We've spent now $16.2 million to ensure our workforce globally is paid fairly. What we've also seen during that time are countries like Iceland was obviously very early, but the UK, France, Germany, Switzerland, leaning in on this issue, creating standards, creating transparency. So I think that it does take some time, but I think these steps make a difference. On sustainability and on the environment, we need to see this move, and we need to see it move faster. And I think there's an incredible role that corporations have to play. And when they pair up with the government and they lobby for this and they act as partners, I think that's where we're going to see the powerful change.
Great. And you, Manny?
So your premise, Ryan, why hasn't progress happened fast enough?
Yeah, or maybe I'm missing some of the progress. Obviously, it exists in pocket. I was more sensing a bit of a gap between the initial investments and the big overall social changes. It feels like we're stuck with problems that maybe are even growing in some cases rather than shrinking, despite all the investments. And so, working through the dissonance there.
I think there are big problems that have been built up over decades or hundreds of years. You try to address racial equity in this country, the United States. That's a long running issue. Climate change is a long running issue. So I would say that I'm actually optimistic. I really do believe there has been a sea change in how all the stakeholders, including corporations like us, treat this. And so the investments that are making with long-term time horizons and how long it actually takes to move the needle on some of these topics and measure them and actually show with facts and data we're moving. I think all of that is happening. And, we can go down any of these issues and say on climate, where we said, okay, we've been carbon neutral for decades, since 2011. That's not enough. So then we sign up to be net zero carbon by 2030. And some companies it's 2040, some companies it's 2050. We're a professional services organization that's actually reasonably digital, as Amy mentioned. Everyone had to become digital. And so, guess what? We had major improvement last year, but it's not sustainable because over half of our footprint historically is air travel. And we're going to get back on planes at some point and travel to see each other. And so as we try to figure out, and every company has this flavor, what are we going to do to invest in, become sustainable by a certain date? And by the way, net zero carbon is not sufficient. At some point, we're going to have to take carbon out of the ground, not just be net zero going in to make a change. Same thing on social issues. So I do think part of why I'm optimistic, if I go back to comments, even Amy and Jonas made at the beginning, the social agenda, the ESG agenda, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, used to be something we did on the side. We would donate X percent of our capacity, we would invest, we would have our people do community volunteer service days. We try to do good on the side. The fact that today we try to put ESG into not the 2% we give away to nonprofit, the 98%, where we're working with investors and corporate clients. And there is no corporate strategy in the world today, I would posit, that isn't taking sustainability and social issues into account. Because if it matters to your employees, and it matters to your customers, and it matters to your investors, guess what? It has to matter to the strategies of companies. Right. And so I'll ask you, my friend, patience. We might not solve all of the world's problems in this time horizon, but I do think, with continued focus on this, and it will get hard, I do think we can make progress. And I think there's progress already being made. So I'll be optimistic about it.
I take it on board. I am a new optimist now. We've got time for a final thought from each of you. So really 30 seconds on anything you wish I'd asked you about, or that you really hope the audience takes home and says to their partner or their pet or whoever once they switch off this call. Let's start with you again, Manny, then Jonas, and Amy gets the last word.
I'll say maybe one topic we didn't cover that I know we're all wrestling with is what is the role of the corporation? What's actually the role of the CEO as a commentator now, or a pundit, or on civic and citizenship issues? I'm not sure any of us signed up when we took this job that people would want your opinion on every topic. Whether it's a law in a state, it's voting rights, it's the environment, it's, should we make a comment on Afghanistan or Gaza Strip? And so trying to be principled and make a difference as a corporate leader without going outside the boundaries of who you are and what you stand for your customers and your employees is something we are all wrestling with. And that's probably a new part of the job. I know I didn't expect that when I signed up for this a few years ago.
They didn't put tightrope walker in the job description? I'm shocked.
It was not in the job description at the time.
Jonas.
I would add a thought around net zero jobs, and that as much effort that we've placed around the climate, the footprint, I think we could evolve to a commitment towards net zero jobs. And by that, I mean organizations that generate new jobs will get credit. Those that for changes in their business models are making changes to their organizations and maybe reducing their workforce would have a commitment to either retrain or reskill workers that are outside of their company remit, so that you get a neutral footprint in terms of every organization's contribution to the labor markets and are really helping address this bifurcation of the workforce where, those with the skills that are no longer adaptable aren't just left, on the side, but actually the organization makes a commitment also for those that have left the organization to give them the skills that they need. And that, I think, will be a wonderful measure of the contributions an organization makes, and also gives the organizations the freedom to make the changes that they need to do to adapt in a changing competitive environment and still be very successful.
Thank you, John. And over to you, Amy.
Making change, making really meaningful change through incremental differences, it takes a long time and it's difficult. If you are sitting with the status quo and trying to tweak little things, it is very hard to make very meaningful change. But we have just been offered the most incredible opportunity in our lifetimes over the last 18 months. The pandemic has been an incredible tragedy, but it has also opened up an entire new way of working. And as we're looking to the future in terms of how we work, how we run our companies, how our employees come back, this is an opportunity for us to do it in a way that's sustainable, that's environmentally sound, and where we can actually make a real difference. And it's not really changing just how we work, it's changing how we live. Work is such a huge aspect of this. This is going to drive where we live, how we work, what are the hours, whether we commute. We all need to lean into this. And by really leaning into this opportunity, I think we can make change that is much more fundamental and move the needle much more quickly.
That's a perfect note to end on. Amy, Jonas, Manny, thank you so much for this wonderful session. I'm Ryan Heath from Politico. And if you've liked this discussion, I've got a new podcast out called Global Insider. First episode drops on Wednesday. And I'm going to be calling these guys and their assistants to see if they'll come on to future episodes. This conversation has been so good. So thank you all for joining and thank you all for listening.